Triathlon Podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors PrecisionHydration.com, who offer electrolyte drinks in different strengths to match how you sweat. You can personalize your hydration strategy today at PrecisionHydration.com and get a free tube or box of pH worth up to $9.99 using the code OxygenAddict. We're also brought to you by foodsell.co.uk, who are the next generation of top tube nutritional carrier for your bike. They're designed to allow endurance triathletes and cyclists to carry enough food and gels while allowing easy access. You can check it out at foodsell.co.uk. And finally, we're brought to you by teamoxygenaddict.com Triathlon Coaching, who've been helping hundreds of age group triathletes to see huge improvements in the 70.3 and Ironman performances. The time training system will help make sure you get the important training done each week in a way that complements the rest of your life. All right, everybody, welcome to the show. It's just me flying solo this week, and I've got a cracker of a show for you lined up. I've got a hydration special. So this is a 1-hour interview of expert information with Andy Blow. He's ex-pro triathlete, the founder of Precision Hydration, and he's probably the man who knows more about electrolyte balance, keeping your fluids in balance and hydration than possibly anybody else on the planet, certainly as it relates to endurance athletes and triathletes trying to race in the heat. So with it having been so crazy hot recently over the summer in the UK, I took the opportunity to get him on a call and just basically got all the information out of him that we can. So it was funny that just after I recorded it, there were a couple of requests for this in the Facebook group saying, we've had a bike fit special and an aerodynamic special. How about getting some help with electrolytes and hydration as well, so we know what we're doing in the heat? So if you're anything like me and you really struggle even training when it gets really hot, I was out for a run earlier on today, and when I got back, I was completely cooked after about 45 minutes. So loads of water, a couple of pH salt tablets, and that had me feeling right again. So it's definitely made a big difference to me taking care of it. Maybe it'll make a big difference to you as well. So hopefully we'll be able to help some people out here. Couple of bits of news though before we get started today, sponsored by Foodsell. So if you don't know, the Foodsell is a top tube nutritional carrier. It's really cool. It bolts onto your top tube bolts if you've got a tri bike, or it fits on with Velcro straps if you've not got those top tube bikes. And it allows you to get either 4 of those big fat gels, a couple of big chunks of flapjack or whatever you like to eat, or even a spares kit. You know, you can get a hole in a tube, a couple of inflatable cartridges, and a little multi-tool in there. That's what I use on my race bike. They're really awesome, and the price has been reduced by £5 to $39.99. Loads of guys we met up with at the Outlaw the other weekend were coming over to the Foodsell stand and having a look at the products and buying them because they were obviously thinking this is what we need to get us through long distance racing. So don't leave it to chance. Don't mess up your aerodynamics by having a really smart suit and then tons of stuff stuck in your back pockets. Get it on the frame in a box that's aerodynamic and gets it all there out of the wind. Okay, now they've got a competition on at the moment. You get a free or you can be entered into a prize draw to win a free entry to Outlaw X, which is taking place on Sunday the 22nd of September at Thoresby Park in Nottingham, when you buy Foodsell between now and August the 7th. So it's only a couple of days left to go as you're listening to this. Select the box at checkout to be entered into the prize draw when you buy a Foodsell from foodsell.co.uk. Right, so the news I've got this week is Outlaw have announced their dates for 2020. So the Outlaw Half Nottingham is going to be on 17th of May 2020, Outlaw Half Holcombe the 28th of June, Full Outlaw Nottingham the 26th of July, and Outlaw X is going to be on the 27th of September next year. I think Half Nottingham, Holcombe and Full Outlaw all sold out this year. And Outlaw X isn't sold out yet, but it's well on the way to doing so. So if you want to race an end of season race, there's going to be a really cool after race party going on there as well, I believe. And you also, breaking news, you get the chance to come and kick my backside because I'm going to be racing as well. Well, I say racing, I'm going to be putting on a lycra outfit and staggering around as best my aging body will let me. But come down and take my scalp. That's my challenge to you. It should be a really good laugh, and it's a great way to round out the season. So entries are still available for that if you go via the Outlaw website. And one other thing before we get to today's today's special interview on our Precision Hydration Special. We haven't got a coach's couch this week, but just a reminder, you can download a copy of our Team Oxygen Addict How to Analyze Your Race Performance document through the link in the show notes. So my advice to everyone is take some time after you've done a race and really go through on a piece of paper with a pen how your race has gone. Collect all the information and all your thoughts down there, and then you've got your thoughts for afterwards in terms of being able to look back on them, maybe when the dust has settled a little bit. And it's really good to collect that, because sometimes you don't actually remember what you actually did. I'll give you an example from my racing. I remember swimming very close to 6 minutes when I did a sprint triathlon a few years ago, and I just did a timed 400 the other day and was a bit disappointed with the result. But when I actually looked back in my training diary, it turned out I'd swum 6:19, not 6 minutes. So I wasn't as far away from that as I thought I was actually going to be. So it just goes to show that having a bit of a record of this stuff can actually G you up a little bit in the future, instead of making you think, oh man, I've got miles to go back to where I used to be. So yeah, you can download a copy of that How to Analyze Your Race Performance document. Once you've been through it, fill it all out. And once you've been through it, if you feel like you've not had the race that you wanted or deserved, or it hasn't gone to plan and you don't really know why, and you're interested in finding out how training with the Team Oxygen Addict methodology and the time training system might be able to help you unlock your performance for next season, I've got one slot available next week where you can jump onto Skype with me and talk through your results and your training, and we'll see if we can help you out and see if we can find some of the missing links of either what's gone wrong in training or what hasn't happened right on race day. And then if you're interested in coaching with us, fantastic. And if not, no worries. There's a link in the show notes. If you pop your email address in there, I'll pick somebody and I'll drop you an email. We'll work out a time that works for both of us, and hopefully we'll see if we can help another listener out. All right, guys, so here we go. This is our interview of the week. It's Andy Blow from Precision Hydration with our hydration special. Okay, so we've got Andy Blow back on the show. Andy, thanks very much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Rob. Great to be back.
I was just hearing the sound of seagulls in the background there as we were waiting for the connection to record. It sounds like you're having a lovely day somewhere down south.
Yeah, we've got a family of nesting seagulls on the unit roof next to our office. So and it's so hot, I've got to keep the window open. So apologies for that if you can hear them.
All right, so. Sorry, man. I was going to say, for the listeners who haven't heard you on the show, we've had you on a couple of times before, but I thought I'd give it a brief introduction to you and your background and precision hydration in general. What I wanted today's show to be was an hour-long hydration special, because over the past few weeks, a few things have happened that have made me think, do you know what? We've got to get the message about hydration and the importance of sodium out there to people a little bit more. So some of the things that have happened is we've had some ridiculous hot spells over in Europe. So a lot of our athletes who've raced in Austria or Germany or Roth, they've had this, they've flown over from the UK and they might have just had sort of normal spring, summer weather over here. They fly into Europe and find that all of a sudden, in some cases, it was like 45 degrees in the shade. And just staying alive in those conditions is hard enough for them to deal with without worrying about staying hydrated on race day. So the hydration aspect is a thing that's become massive within the Facebook groups, where we've seen people sort of saying, look, I either didn't have the race I wanted and I just felt really sick on race day. I've got loads of cramps on race day. I just couldn't deal with this extreme heat. Or it was talking about people wondering how they could get almost like preloaded with hydration before race day, because they're aware if it's going to be hot, they need to take care of this kind of stuff. So I thought, what better time to get you back on the show in the summertime, talk about the importance of hydration and the things that go along with hydration other than just drinking water, because there's a bit more to it than that, isn't there?
Definitely. Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
So for the guys who haven't heard you before, you were one of the top pros racing when I started racing back in the early 2000s. You finished, let me get this right, did you finish second at Ironman UK 70.3 back when it was down in Sherborne?
Yeah, third. So
third
your memory's better than my actual performance, Rob.
There you go, promoted you.
Yeah.
So you raced as a pro triathlete and you had a very successful career along those lines. And how did you end up shuffling from that into starting Precision Hydration, and what led to the formation of the company and the interest in hydration in general?
Well, I'd always had a bit of an interest in it because I studied sports science and exercise physiology, so I was naturally sort of inclined to being interested in that, all sorts of areas of performance. And when I was doing triathlon, I was working as a sports scientist some of the time and coaching athletes. But it was towards the end of my career when I started to race more abroad and in hotter races quite often. I did Kona in 2004, and just fell apart basically, despite in the build-up being really quite fit. And then the same happened in other hot events. And the long story short was I found out through doing sweat testing and things that my sweat losses were very high and my sodium losses in my sweat were very high. And I did have a few races after that to correct my sodium and fluid intake, and it was like night and day for me. It was such a difference to my performance in the heat and in hot weather especially, that it was something that I wished I'd have found out about when I was a bit younger, and when it could have had more of an impact on some of the bigger races I did. But I guess as an athlete, I sort of parked that for a while because I was getting on with other things. And then as I retired from competing as being the main thing that I was doing and started working with more and more athletes, I started to investigate sweat testing and why it wasn't particularly available to athletes. I started to use a piece of technology that we still use nowadays, which was originally developed for the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, to test athletes' sweat and then start tweaking and individualizing their hydration plans. And over time that evolved into what is now, the company Precision Hydration. We've been going strong for nearly 10 years now.
Well, it's very interesting for me that you managed to get all this started, because I love it when someone comes along and has like this unique idea about, for example, using the cystic fibrosis equipment to test sweat for sodium loss. Because obviously you've explained to me in the past that's one of the ways people test for cystic fibrosis, isn't it? They have an incredibly high sodium content in the sweat. And when I met you a couple of years ago at Ironman UK and had the sweat test done, firstly, it's just, you basically just have a little electrode strapped onto your arm, don't you? And it kind of teases sweat out of your arm, and over a 20-minute period, it gets run through a machine. It's completely painless. And all of a sudden you've got an answer to this question of, I was similar to you. I was always puzzled as to why whenever it was really hot, I don't think fall apart really quite described the effects I had. I ended up, pretty in the medical tent, as I'm sure you did actually.
Yeah.
In the medical tent, having 2 or 3 bags of IV, and after my last sort of proper race at the World Championships in 2008 in Almere, when it was over 30 degrees in the sun that day, I just couldn't stop throwing up after the race. It was like I was drunk. I was carried into the medical tent. I was just continually vomiting, and the doctors were really worried about me. And I didn't come round until a point where, when I eventually left the medical tent, the whole of the event had been packed away, and there was just the medical tent left there. So for me at that time, I didn't know what was going on, other than like I was really, really dehydrated. But I couldn't understand it because I felt like I was drinking enough during the race. And when you have the sweat test done and you find out just how much sodium you're losing, even at the time, I think I was supplementing with maybe 250 or 500 milligrams of sodium an hour. It wasn't even touching the sides with a guy like me. And I think you were the same, weren't you?
Definitely. I was trialing out electrolyte tablets and salt tablets and things like that in my races, because I had this vague awareness that, you should be taking electrolytes. But even as a physiologist, I had no real conception of what an appropriate dose was, or in fact at that time the dosage was relatively or fundamentally an individual thing. And like you've mentioned, if you take a typical electrolyte drink, you might get 400 or 500 milligrams of sodium per litre, and let's say you're drinking a lot and you're drinking close to a litre an hour, that could be less than a quarter of what you're losing. Now, over an hour or two, that doesn't matter too much. But with people like you and I, we're losing over 1,500 or 1,800 milligrams of sodium per litre of sweat on average. I found that if I was not putting in, over 1,000 milligrams per hour, often up closer to 1,500 milligrams of sodium per hour, then I would degrade and end up in a similar situation to you, feeling quite nauseous and lightheaded. I mean, you mentioned being sick, and it's hard to diagnose, years after and without lots more information. But one reason why some people are very sick, especially if they're drunk a lot in events, is actually because their body's trying to get the water out to stop them diluting their sodium levels even lower, because they've been over consuming fluid. So it is one of those areas that I still, although we're making headway in helping to educate people on the fact that individual needs vary so wildly, I still think it's relatively poorly understood in the sport.
Yeah, I think so too. And at the time, I considered just like the fact I had salt tablets. I don't think very many people even had them around at the time. I was buying them from America. There were these salt stick things that you could get back then.
Yeah.
And even having one or two of those an hour, I was thinking, well, I'm banging loads of sodium in here with 500 milligrams extra. That should be fixing it. But of course, back then, you were literally putting salt into your drinks, and that has the effect of making it taste like seawater if you put too much in it. So I think that's something that's really clever that you guys have done, is that it doesn't taste salty in the drink. That's the real challenge of getting sodium in without just having table salt, isn't it? Is not tasting salty and feeling sick as you're drinking it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because when you are getting low on salt and you crave sort of salty foods, salt on food washed down with drinks tends to taste good and tastes okay. But if you start putting in significant amounts of salt into drinks, for some reason the body doesn't like that. It finds it quite irritating on the stomach and quite unpalatable in your mouth. So we tend to use blends of sodium carbonate, sodium citrate, and they're commonly used in sports nutrition products because they'd still deliver a decent amount of sodium, but without that overtly really salty taste. Which sodium chloride or table salt is about 39% sodium and 61% chloride. So if you want to get close to, if you want to get a gram, say, of actual sodium into your system, you got to add, several grams of sodium chloride, which is several teaspoons of salt to a drink. And as you can imagine, that's just going to taste nasty and make you feel quite sick. So I think one of the things, for people who have higher sodium losses, trying to take sodium in a more palatable form during a long duration event is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are some of the other problems not problems so much as, but what I'm hoping we can do here is we can educate people as they're listening. And I know we've got, thousands and thousands of people who will have raced across Europe at either Austria or Roth or Germany or, say, Half Outlaw Holcomb over the past few weeks. If they've raced in the heat and they've not had the kind of race that they'd hoped for, what might be some of the symptoms that they'll have experienced that might be connected to dehydration without them realizing it?
I think the first thing to say is probably to define two different conditions that can happen when you're exercising and sweating a lot. And you've got dehydration, which everyone is the common one that people think of, because fundamentally when you exercise in the heat, you know that you sweat a lot. Most people don't drink as much as they sweat out because, and that's not a bad thing, by the way, because a level of dehydration is very tolerable to the body during exercise. But fundamentally, you become dehydrated when you lose a degree of or an amount of your body fluid and it goes unreplaced. And as I say, a small amount of dehydration is usually tolerable, but a large amount becomes problematic. But in general, although people can become quite dehydrated during long events in the heat, because what happens when you become dehydrated is you get very thirsty. Because you get thirsty, that's a powerful urge, and you tend to drink. And with the availability of drinks, on the bike in a triathlon or at the aid stations on the run course, if you get really thirsty, there's usually an opportunity to quench that thirst. So dehydration isn't necessarily as prevalent a problem as people would think it to be, compared with something a bit more subtle, which is a kind of combination of something called hyponatremia and dehydration. And hyponatremia is what happens when the levels of sodium in your body and in your blood specifically get diluted. And that can happen through two mechanisms. One, when you sweat and lose a lot of salt, you then consume fluids, and that dilutes the levels of salt in your body down further if there's not a high amount of salt in those drinks. And I think what happens to a lot of people is that they confuse this idea of pure dehydration with hyponatremia, because even though they might drink a fair bit, if it's not got enough salt in it, they're not correcting the homeostasis in their body as it wants to be corrected. They're only replacing one component of what they're losing. So when people feel lousy in the heat, if they've been drinking a reasonable amount, it could be down to them not taking enough salt in relation to the water that they're consuming, as opposed to just purely not taking in enough water.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know for sure when I was racing, I remember distinctly doing the Nice triathlon before it was an Ironman. It was long distance world championships. It was very, very hot. And I remember feeling pretty lousy on the bike in the event and thinking, it's super hot. I can feel the sweat dripping off me. Although I've been drinking a lot, maybe I've not been drinking enough. And I continued to then drink more and more. And I was mainly drinking water at the time. And then, of course, I felt a bit worse because I was presumably, diluting myself and becoming more hyponatremic. But my crazy thought process then was, well, maybe I need to drink more because my performance is still going downhill. So I kind of doubled down on the mistake. And I'm quite convinced that in the heat, that happens to a lot of people, especially people who aren't very experienced at racing in the heat or have gone from somewhere cold to somewhere hot. And it's a bit of a shock because this mental perception is, I'm going to get dehydrated. I need to drink loads. And therefore, the answer to all the problems becomes drinking more rather than drinking more appropriately.
Do you know, I think that almost exactly mirrors my experience out in Almere. I can remember they had a really strange energy drink available, or water. It was called Squeezy, I think, or something.
Yeah.
And one taste of it, I was just, I've not tried this in training. I'm not having that. So I wasn't taking any electrolytes in. I was just taking water on the bike. And it was what would it have been, about a 4-hour bike leg? I think it was the 03 distance. So it wasn't even like it was an Ironman distance bike leg where I was out for 6 hours. It was only 4 hours. But I can remember just trying to drink more water because I was so hot and pouring it over me. And exactly that, like feeling the water just sitting there in my gut and not really going anywhere. So probably riding too hard as well. That was probably part of it. But maybe having one salt tablet every half an hour. I think I would maybe have got through that with the salt stick. So maybe 250 milligrams of sodium. So now looking back, I realise I'd been losing net 1,500 grams of sodium for each of those 3.5 hours I was out there on the bike. So I probably started to run 5 grams of sodium down.
Yeah.
And just trying to drink when it's so hot, just your brain starts to do funny things with you, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And you start to, I think looking back at my own naivety when it came to most aspects of nutrition, but specifically nutrition and hydration, was I didn't really understand what was a large amount or a little amount to drink per hour. I didn't understand what was a large or a little amount of salt, and I didn't understand what was a large or a little amount of calories. And now when I talk to athletes on a one-to-one level, we talk a lot about these sort of 3 key areas that when you're exercising hard for a prolonged period of time, you're going to need an amount of calories per hour, an amount of fluid, and an amount of salt. But the actual ratio of those 3 and the individual amounts of them are going to vary based on lots of different things. So carbohydrate requirements, are probably more down to essentially, in my opinion anyway, what you can absorb. You're almost always going to be in deficit. So if you've got a good resilient gut and stomach and you can basically get more carbohydrates in and absorb and use them, then that's a benefit. So we often play around with different amounts of carbohydrate for athletes, but that's almost like trying to hit the ceiling of what you can reliably get in. With fluids and salts, it's very different though, because on a cold day you might need very little sodium and fluid, and on a hot day you might need a very large amount. And coupled with that, there's as we've learned, you and I, there's individual variants and needs, because for me and you, when it gets hot, we're just going to lose a ton of salt as well as quite a bit of fluid, so that requirement goes up as well. And as you've talked about, for yourself that 200-300 milligrams an hour or whatever is a negligible and small amount for a long event. We've learned that, you and I have learned that the hard way. Interestingly, I've worked with athletes who and a couple of them, it's been very interesting to talk to them, because they've poo-pooed the idea of electrolytes, saying, they're a waste of time, overhyped. And when you test these people, quite often you find that actually their sweat and sodium losses are quite low.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is, in my experience, electrolytes aren't really a huge necessity for performance, but that's based on the fact that their losses are potentially quite low.
Yeah.
Whereas people like you and I become quite evangelical about the fact that taking in a large amount of sodium and potentially quite a bit of fluid with it is really helpful because our bodies need it. And I think that when I started off down this road, I was definitely more of a blanket advocate for lots of salt and lots of fluid for all athletes, because I was going down that N of 1 sample. This really works for me.
Yeah.
Now, many years later, I'm a lot more open to the fact that a lot of the disagreement that happens in sports science, sports nutrition, coaching, on athlete forums and all the rest of it occurs because people are comparing apples with oranges, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. So it all becomes about figuring out your individual needs.
Yeah, totally. I really love that, Andy. I really love the idea of approaching everybody as an individual, and also sort of saying in different conditions, each individual is going to be different as well.
Well, I've got a good example. Sorry to
go on.
Interject, Robert. I've got a great example of that, I think, because I had email contact recently from a guy whose name you might well know. Actually, I'm just going to check what it was. It's Alan Hovda, who's Norwegian triathlete. I believe he's the record holder at the Norseman. He's won it a number of times.
Yeah, okay.
He's a hardcore dude, and he's just again, I'm freestyling here because I can't remember for sure, but I'm pretty sure he did a very good time at Ironman Texas this year, like 8:20 or something like that.
Yeah.
So he's serious. He's got the Norwegian Ironman record, I think. But Alan is interesting because I've not actually spoken to him in person yet, but I wrote a blog about drinking water to thirst, which is an idea that's been presented by a physiologist called Tim Noakes as being the answer to everyone's hydration issues. Is just drink water when you're thirsty, listen to your body, and you'll be fine. Is his essentially the summary of his argument.
Yeah.
And he wrote a massive book called Waterlogged, all about that position, which is actually has a lot of good stuff in there. It's a lot of it is about not over drinking and not getting hyponatremia, which is a real killer in endurance sport, and therefore it's not my sort of theme here is not to completely attack and knock what he's done. He's an incredibly accomplished and impressive researcher and doctor and athlete, but this guy Alan wrote a blog a few years ago about the fact that he'd done Norseman, got the course record, he'd drunk water to thirst, and therefore this vindicated Tim Noakes' approach. That's all you need to do. It's been overhyped, and since then though, Alan's been in touch with me and he's read a lot of the stuff on our blog on precisionhydration.com and started following us, and he's raced in a lot of different conditions, and he said in his email, I now understand, based on more experience, that it looked like drinking according to thirst is the way to go in some conditions, like during the 2015 Norseman when I only drank 1.3 litres of fluid during the first 6 hours, but it was cold.
Yeah.
Now I know that was in Norseman. However, Kona or many other triathlon races, which are usually in way hotter conditions, these are something completely else, and a different approach is required, with more attention to the salt intake. So I found that really interesting, that he was a guy who'd done a little bit like some other athletes I've come across have done, is become quite dogmatic about one viewpoint in hydration, which for him was, look, I've done this race, I've done brilliantly well, therefore what I did in that race is the answer to everything, and end of story. Then he's been humble enough, though, to go away. Obviously, I presume, and I'm going to chat to him about it later in the week, hopefully, is, gone away and done some longer, hotter races and gone, do you know what, this approach doesn't work in these different circumstances. Even though it's the same body, it's the same, he's still training hard, he's still fit, he has to take a different approach. And I think having the humility to then turn around and actually be able to say, do you know what, I think I was wrong about that, is really interesting, and it's rare as well. Because especially in the world of training and sports nutrition and all that kind of thing, people get very dogmatic views and then become quite invested in those views, and I find that quite quite difficult to deal with, because I understand it, because I've been like that myself in the past about certain things, but I do find it difficult to deal with, and I find it results in the field of hydration, especially, in some pretty fruitless arguments between people, because people come at this with either a view that, yeah, you need to take loads of salt, yeah, you don't, salt's a waste of time, yeah, you just need to drink to thirst, or you just need to drink this or X, Y, or Z, and like we said, this whole thing about it being highly individual is really the root of it. And it's just, the problem with that is it's not a funky little soundbite that you can then trot out and give to everyone as your top tip, because, and also it does, in some people also see it as a bit of a cop out, because okay, there must be something more to it. You can't just say it's individual. There must be some guidelines. And that's where the interesting bit for me is okay, how do we establish what those guidelines are for an individual? And that's really where things like what I feel like is where our sweat test comes in, because it helps to start individuals investigating, okay, what's your physiology like? What's your race history? We ask all the questions when we do the test about the race history and what kind of stuff they've been doing. We look at sweat rates, we look at the kind of environment that we're working out in or racing in, and try to then provide what we're increasingly calling things sort of hydration guardrails, which is indicating to people the kind of volumes of fluid that might work for them based on what we know, the kind of levels of salt replacement that should work for them, but then encouraging them to go and do some trial and error and do some performance analysis off the back of trying those things out, because that's ultimately where you find out what really works.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've done a very similar thing with the guys in Team Oxygen Addict this year. We've given them a race preparation document, and as part of it, we made them write out the plan for the race. This is what you're going to do in terms of process, rather than, I want to do a 60-minute swim. We say my plan for the race is, if it's hot, I'm going to drink this much in terms of volume. I'm going to need this much sodium. If it's not as hot, I'm going to need, and it's a way to get someone to consider beforehand, all right, this is going to be the guidelines I'm going to have. There's no thinking about it on race day then, is there? There's no guesswork. And while it's nice to say just drink to thirst, I think it is a bit more complicated than that when you're trying to perform, especially over very long distances, and especially when it's very, very hot. So having the guideline of you're probably going to need a bit more than you think you are is a good starting point. So consider that before you get started, and have something of a plan so that you've got something to measure that against as you're riding, and think, well, if you've got to the 3-hour point of an Ironman bike leg and you've only drunk 1 bottle of water, that might be on the low side, and you might need to be trying to correct it at that point.
That's exactly it, because like with you and I think if we'd have been able to, if we'd have had something to base an analysis off, of saying, well, I remember in Nice, I was effectively drinking as much as I could. And at some point, I should have, if I'd have had an upper parameter about what an idea of a reasonable hourly fluid intake for me was, and once I've got to sort of 1.5 times that and it's still not helping, then you got to start to take that as a bit of a sign to go, actually, maybe I'm like barking up the wrong tree here. I need to start looking at something else instead. But I didn't have that prior knowledge, and the interesting thing, about racing is that we all kind of become this slightly, or often become this slightly less right thinking person during the race. The stress kicks in and the excitement kicks in. I mean, I've chatted this year to Tim Reed about this quite a bit. So you probably know who Tim is, and he's been 70.3 Ironman world champion. But Tim has historically had a lot of issues in Ironman races, a lot of which he puts down to his sweat rate. So he sweats absolutely buckets. For a guy who's not that big, he's got a prodigious sweat rate. And so he's done lots of sweat testing himself over the years. Very analytical guy who tests and tweaks a lot of things. And we've been helping him dial in his electrolyte strategy. But he's adamant, because I chatted to him about the whole drinking to thirst thing, which he's tried out. And his comment on that is that basically he drinks to a pretty rigid plan in the first 3 or 4 hours of an event, because he said that, for him, even with his experience, the fight or flight response and the dry mouth you get from being nervous, and the occupation of the brain about thinking about tactics and thinking about race position and everything else, means that he can easily not do a good job of drinking and eating in the first few hours. And it's only after he's got those first few hours under his belt, when he's consumed what he needs to consume to a plan, that he then starts to feel it out a bit more and respond to his instincts and listen to his body and settle in. And I think that's a fantastic approach. And it's certainly, although it's not clear whether it's working for him, perfectly yet, he's definitely had some much improved performances over Ironman this year. Partly, I think, down to that approach and some other things he's learned. So this idea of, there being a blended approach between listening to your body and listening to your instincts and, drinking to a plan. I spend a lot of time trying to explain to people that these are not binary options. It's a bit like having power output guidelines for what you're going to ride to on the bike. People will argue, I just ride to feel, or I have a plan of what power I'm going to push. But in reality, I think all the good athletes will probably use a blended approach where they know what kind of power range they want to be in during certain times of an event. But at the end of the day, they're also going to have to adapt that on the fly.
Absolutely.
We all know how easy it is to go out hard in an Ironman and then fall off. So having an upper power limit early on is probably a good thing, but maybe also having a bit of a lower power limit that you don't want to drop below in the middle and late part of the race when you've got to dig a bit deeper is also beneficial to your performance. But it doesn't mean you're just trying to stick at the same power the whole way, or you're not being completely rigid with it. You might have to flex. There might be headwinds and tailwinds and tactical reasons to go faster or slower at certain points. And I think treating hydration, nutrition in the same way is really important. You have that sort of outline plan based on a bit of experience, based on a bit of trial and error, based on some scientific research you've done about your own body, and then, all being well, on the day you can take all of that and then actually turn it into a good performance.
Now, you talked a little bit about some guidelines before. I wanted to come back to that for a second. Yeah. Am I right in remembering you having said, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but does the concentration of sodium in our sweat for one given person, does that stay the same pretty much given any time of year, any heat? Is it just pretty much your number is your number, and that's how concentrated your sweat is?
So sort of yes is what I would say.
Okay.
No one knows for sure about all the factors that affect sodium loss in sweat, but some of them are clearly changeable and some of them are clearly fixed and genetic. My personal view on this, based on doing thousands of sweat tests and lots of repeat sweat tests with a lot of athletes, is that it's extremely rare to see an athlete's sweat sodium level move dramatically at any point. So I've been sweat tested hundreds of times through the course of what we do work wise, and my scores are always very, very high, always within a few percentage points. And that will be, and I'll spend extended periods earlier this year I was out in Arizona for about 2 weeks. I then came home for a couple of days and went to Australia for a couple of weeks. So I was in hot conditions for nearly a month, and my sweat sodium levels dropped by about sort of 6 or 7%, because I was tested at the start of that period and at the end. And that's been similar for a number of years now. And although that's a significant change, in one respect, it's not significant in terms of the magnitude of what I'd need to replace in an Ironman, say. It's kind of it's something and nothing. It's like if I was a medium t-shirt, in January, for me, unless something dramatic happens to my lifestyle and diet and training, I'm going to be a medium t-shirt in July and probably still in December. So what we don't talk about it definitively, because things like acclimatization to the heat can affect your sweat sodium composition, and different scientific papers show different magnitudes of effect. Some think they've shown 25-30% decrease in sodium loss in sweat when people get acclimatized to the heat. And I'm definitely not going to say that that's not possible, but I think, based on my experience, that's far more at the extreme end of what could happen. And that's maybe if you take non-athletes, non-acclimatized people, and then vigorously acclimatize them to a hot environment. The amount of testing that we've done with athletes, on multiple days and on multiple occasions tends to indicate that, okay, your sweat sodium is in the ballpark where it's measured, all things being equal, and then it might fluctuate up and down from that slightly. But fundamentally, if you're a low sodium sweater, you're not going to suddenly jump to being very high.
Yeah,
if you're very high, like you and I've never seen it in someone jump to low all of a sudden.
Yeah. Okay.
So in that aspect, I'd say it's a guide. Just without labouring the point too much, we sell a lot of our sweat testing technology into pro sports teams outside of endurance events. So a lot of big customers for us in the US nowadays with Major League Baseball. And there was a physiologist in one of the teams where we sold a sweat testing machine to him, and we said you probably want to test your athletes at the start of the year, but after that, you want to test your new signings, and you can rely on the older numbers. And he was adamant he was going to test everyone every year because he was doing his job properly and he wanted to see any fluctuation and variation. After 2 or 3 years of doing that, he's flipped to just testing the new guys because he's pretty confident that he's seeing insignificant levels of variation when he repeat tests other guys and doesn't want to repeat the work.
Got you.
So that's kind of very anecdotal, circumstantial evidence. This isn't stuff that's been peer reviewed and published in the literature, but it's what I'm seeing working with athletes is that once you know this number, I would say it's a good guide to what your sodium losses are likely to be per litre of sweat. Of course, the amount that you sweat is going to vary much more. And
now that's the key, isn't it? Yeah, that's the thing that I was going to come on to say next, because I was gonna relate a conversation that I had with my training partner, which was that during the winter, I can go out and do a long ride on a day when it's cold and come back and possibly not even have picked my first bottle out of the bike holder after 2 or 3 hours out, just because I'm not thirsty. It's cold. I don't feel like I've sweated. I get undressed at the end of it. My top's still dry underneath. And you think, right, well, it's a bit of an example of what you said about the Norseman competitor, isn't it? Alan's seen the same thing. You don't sweat very much when it's cold. Similarly, you go for a long run in the winter. You don't sweat very much when it's cold. But then I almost need to make a shift in my brain as we come from winter into spring and then definitely into summer, because I almost forget about taking electrolytes unless I'm doing a heavy turbo session.
Yeah.
It kind of goes out the window for me during the winter because I just don't feel like I need them then. Coming to the summertime, though, I go and do a 90-minute run in the sunshine, and I get back and I can feel crispy and dehydrated all day long.
Yeah.
And it's because I haven't got in the habit yet of thinking, right, you're not just needing water when you're out running now. You need to have the sodium in the water to replace that you're going to lose.
Definitely. And I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head with the fact that your hydration plan's got to be adaptable, and that most of the time in cool conditions with moderate training, etc., then listening to your body, drinking to thirst, drinking mainly water, etc., it's all absolutely fine. Your body will self-correct. After training, if you do get a little bit dehydrated, you'll get electrolytes and sodium in through your foods. You'll drink some water. You'll balance it all out, and within a 24-hour period, you'll be back to normal, and all will be good. Where the problems creep in is, you suddenly start upping the training, like you say, towards the summer. You're doing 2 sessions a day. You're sweating a lot more, maybe even in between sessions with warmer weather. Yeah. And all of a sudden your hydration fluid, your body fluid turnover within a 24-hour period can be dramatically higher. On a really extreme case of this, I've seen studies of some of the people who have the biggest body fluid turnovers are probably sort of Tour de France riders and American football players in pre-season. What Tour de France riders, because of the hot conditions and because of the amount of hours of activity they do, the American footballers more because of the size of the guys and the protective clothing that they wear and the fact they do what they call 2-a-day practices in the summer. And I've seen studies where in order to normalise their hydration levels, some tour riders are having to drink 11 or 12 litres of fluid in a 24-hour period.
Wow.
Where there was one American football player who they reckoned was having to drink something like 18 litres in 24 hours to match his incredible sweat losses. Now, I don't want to give out the impression that that's normal. This guy is probably, I don't know, must be 150 kilos and massive high work rate and all the rest of it. And riding a 6-hour mountain stage in the heat in the Tour de France is clearly a very, very arduous activity. So these are not normal circumstances, but they do show the wide variation of what you might need versus, what is normal.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about guidelines for people. But before we do that, let me ask you this. Is there any danger to having too much sodium in your drinks? Can people hurt themselves if they're going to put sodium sachets in for race day? Is there anything that might go wrong the other way for them?
You're more likely to get an upset stomach as a first instance, I would say, with overdoing sodium acutely in the short term. So if you're just taking too much sodium in, you'll probably get that kind of horrible cotton type mouth, like you get if you've eaten too many bags of crisps or salted peanuts or something, where salt starts to taste nasty. And if you're over salting, you might just be craving plain water because you're driving your body's salt levels up, and you might get an upset stomach. You would to actually make yourself properly ill by taking too much sodium in, you would really have to take a lot in, because we've been asked about that before. Can I overdose drinking a sports drink? And the sort of short answer is no, not really. But like anything else, I would never say that. The problem with presenting that information then is that athletes think, okay, I'll just take a little bit more because that'll be better.
Yeah.
I always think that it's what we're aiming for with electrolytes and fluids when you're racing is kind of the lowest effective dose.
Yeah, there you go.
So just going hard with it is a bit Neanderthal and a bit unnecessary, and it can result in you feeling a bit, it's whacking you, it's challenging your body to sort of push its homeostatic mechanisms really, really hard when maybe you don't need it to. Hence what we're trying to do is get about the right amount of fluid and sodium in, because your body's fantastic at self-regulation. It will pee or it will retain extra fluid if you need it. It will pee out or retain extra sodium if you need it. So we always talk about hitting the barn door and not the bullseye. You only get it wrong when you're really off target with it.
Yeah. Got you. Okay. So we mentioned a little bit about some guidelines then, and you said it's good to have those. Did you call them hydration guardrails?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that then, if we can, for the athlete who's listening. First of all, if they haven't been to your website and taken the online sweat test, that's a real good, effective use of a minute, isn't it? Just go on and answer a few questions, and that'll point them in the direction of whether they're either a heavy sweater or a salty sweater, just by answering a few questions.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we designed that for, because we were getting a lot of requests when we started out for sweat tests, but for people who couldn't come and visit us, or it wasn't convenient to, or they didn't maybe want to spend the money on a sweat test to start with. So we developed the online test, which, as you say, takes literally a minute or two to fill out. We try to ask the right questions in that, and we've built an algorithm behind it that then sort of assesses whether you're likely to be a light, a medium, or a high or very high sweater, and whether you show any of the signs and symptoms of high or of high salt loss or not. And then that starts to point you in the direction of, okay, well, where should you start your trial and error? How strong a drink might you need when you're doing longer, hotter stuff, and how much of it might you need? Now, the question of sort of how much in terms of the guardrails is always a tricky one. But like you've pointed out, in very cool conditions and when the workloads aren't high, the lower limit of what people need per hour is often zero. There's lots of activities where, especially shorter activities, where actually you don't need to drink. And certainly I would always say, for most activities less than an hour, potentially for fit people who are well conditioned to what they're doing in moderate conditions, up to 90 minutes, you ought to be absolutely fine without a drink. That doesn't mean you should abstain from drinking or not drink if you feel thirsty, but it also means that, you should, unless you're turning up to those sessions dehydrated, then drinking during them probably isn't going to be massively influential on how you perform. When you get beyond that, it starts to change. And, kind of for us in longer endurance events, a low amount of fluid per hour is 400-500 millilitres an hour. A high amount is double that, around a litre or just over a litre an hour. Now, we know that there are athletes that can absorb and utilise more than that. We know there are some outlier athletes that get away with drinking a fair bit less than that. But as a ballpark figure, that sort of 500 to 1,000 millilitres is often where we get people to start their trial and error process.
Good stuff. And then in terms of a guideline for how much sodium to have in their drink, the standard sports drinks that come, like any standard electrolyte, Gator, whatever.
Yeah.
How much will that have in for a 500 milligram bottle?
So for a five in net terms, for a 500 milliliter bottle, they'll usually have about 200 to 250 milligrams of sodium. So around about 500 milligrams per liter as a relative concentration.
Got you.
To put that in perspective, your blood runs at about 3,600 milligrams per liter. And your sweat can vary anywhere between, or an individual's sweat could be as low as 200 milligrams a litre, and it could be as high as 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams a litre. I think you were up at, 1,800, Rob?
Yeah,
something like that, which is in the top sort of 10% of what people would potentially lose.
It's the only time I'm getting in the top 10% of anything these days, Andy.
It's you and me both, Rob. We're right up there. And so the sort of that's the range, and therefore, as a shameless plug at this point of our products, we made product at 500 milligrams per litre, which is our lower strength electrolyte drink for using during activity. And that's what we recommend, if people only have relatively low to moderate losses but want to put some electrolyte supplementation into their bottle, that's a good level. But the biggest selling product that we have is the next one up, which is the 1,000 milligram per litre product. And that is, we're not entirely sure, but we think that the reason that's the biggest selling product a lot of the time is because when we test people, the average human sweat sodium composition is around 900 to 1,000 milligrams per litre. So via sort of testing, via trial and error, we find that a lot of people who are doing longer and hotter events find that level, so about double the level that's in a standard sports drink, seems to be a happy medium for a large amount of people. So the kind of 1,000 milligrams per litre. Then we also make one which is 1,500 milligrams per litre, which is for the top 10%ers like us. And I personally, find that is a total game changer for me. On a hot day, I'll have one of those before. I'll keep one with me during and try and have one after any significantly big training session or race, and undoubtedly feel a lot better for doing it.
Yeah, I think for me the thing I notice is when I stay on top of this when I'm training, especially twice a day, it's the knock-on effect. It's never just one session, but it's the knock-on effect of double sessions over the course of a week, where I get to the third day and think, I'm starting to feel rotten now. And it's often because I haven't taken care of it before that first session or after that second session. It's a constant process of keeping it mindful.
Yeah, you get this kind of stepwise depletion effect where you start on day one okay, but then if you don't quite keep up with your losses, you're starting on the back foot a little bit day two, and so on and so forth. We see it with, sometimes with tennis players that we work with whose losses mount up over the course of a tournament or over back-to-back days, and that's always a really interesting one because those guys or girls don't often know how long they're going to. It's not like an Ironman where you have an idea of how long you might be going for.
Yeah,
they might be involved in a 2 or 3 set 60 to 90 minute walkover, or they might be out there for hours and hours in the blazing heat, and they often suffer with those kind of things where it's not the one acute thing that you do that knocks your hydration and electrolyte balance out of whack. It's the cumulative effect of back-to-back days, which is why we often say the rationale for using some supplementation in training is not necessarily to maximize performance out and out in a single session. It's just to try and stay relatively on top of things so you're not falling into a bit of a hole over the course of a week.
Yeah. And especially when you consider that anybody who buys like a commercially available bottle from the supermarket, even drinking one of those is actually, it's a net sodium loss for the fluid they're replacing. If there's only 500 mils per litre in it, and they actually, most people are sweating at 1,000 mils per litre, even having an electrolyte drink, which I think a lot of people don't even bother with. They either choose plain water, don't they? Or yeah, that's something to consider for sure.
Also, the fact that for rehydration purposes, although isotonic drinks, which are the classic Lucozade, Gatorade type ones, aren't bad for rehydration. They're actually skewed. Their composition is skewed a lot towards delivering energy through the form of carbohydrate rather than fluids. And a good solution for purely for rehydration will be hypertonic, not isotonic. So it'll be a lower concentration your blood, and so has a lot less carbohydrates in, but often higher in sodium, because that's what helps you retain it in the bloodstream.
Yeah. Okay. Got you. Okay. So who are some of the people who you've worked with in the triathlon world that you would be able to sort of say, do you know what, we've worked with this athlete and this is the effect we've helped them have on their performance in the heat?
I think I mentioned him already, but I think Tim Reed's an interesting one and I hope you won't mind me mentioning it, because it's not a commercial arrangement we have with Tim, and we're not a sponsor of Tim's or anything like that. He uses our products in amongst with some other things as well, but Tim's been an interesting one to chat with and to help him, in a small way develop his plan, because he's very high in terms of these overall sodium losses, and this idea of playing around with the concentration of his drink and the amount he was consuming in the early stage of a race has been, I think, quite impactful on what he's doing. Sarah Crowley is another one who I know you've had Sarah on, and chatted with her. Now Sarah's just a phenomenal athlete, and
sure
someone who's, I've been out and sort of witnessed her training in Brisbane, and when we're doing a bit of media stuff with her earlier this year, and she is hardcore and trains very, very hard, very long sessions, often in very hot weather. Now she's an interesting one because her sweat sodium losses are quite low, but she finds that she uses the products quite a lot in training for exactly the reason we've just been discussing, in that her sweat volume loss is so high over a day or a week that she needs to stay topped up during sessions, otherwise she finds that she starts to crack. And she has this little thing she talks about called the incident, where she basically flaked out in, I think it was up at Park City, Utah, when she was training up at altitude, because she'd got extremely dehydrated, and it took her, she started using the pH 1500s, and that's what got her out of the hole. And one of the things that led her to start, talking to us in more detail about working with us, was she suddenly realised, this effect that cumulative dehydration could have if she didn't manage it right with her heavy training load.
Yeah. Now, for athletes who are listening who are going to go and do a race, and I'm particularly England biased here, and apologies to the listeners in the rest of the world, but with very changeable weather conditions, right now outside my window it's overcast and probably 15 degrees, and it's forecast to be in the mid-20s in 2 days' time.
Yeah.
So is there anything that athletes can do to prepare in terms of like getting ahead of the game a little bit for race day and preloading with sodium, or pre-hydrating almost ahead of an event?
Yeah, there's a common mistake when you're going to be racing in the heat, or when you think it might be hot at the weekend for a race, I see with athletes, is over drinking in the days building up, because we've all been taught that carbohydrate loading is a good thing, and your body can actually store and absorb quite a large amount of carbohydrate in the muscles and in the liver before race day. So you can start a few days out loading up, and that's all good. The same is not really true with fluids, or not as true, because your capacity to absorb and hold on to extra fluids is limited. Your kidneys do a really strong job of getting rid of excess fluid when you put it in. So as obvious as it sounds, the more you drink in the days leading up, the more you're going to wee, and you'll eventually just, if you over drink, you'll just be weeing out fluids and, ironically, some electrolytes as well. So I'm sure I used to do this, but I'm sure a lot of athletes start events in a semi-hyponatremic state because they just drink way too much water before a hot event. I know that it happened to Jodie Swallow, or Jodie Kunama as she is now, in Hawaii a few years ago, where she collapsed with hyponatremia, and she cited the fact that she'd just been smashing water in the days before the race, because she was worried about the hydration and trying to, get on top of it as she can. And I think that's more common than people realise.
Yeah.
So to counteract it, what you can do, because obviously there is a level of sort of hydration loading you can do, the way to do it is to use a strong electrolyte drink. And there's been different studies done suggesting that really, really strong electrolyte drinks, like those that are over 3,000 milligrams per litre, are the most effective for immediate fluid loading before competition. However, in my experience, although they sort of have the most pronounced effect on blood volume, according to the studies, they're often 3,000 milligrams of sodium per litre drink is like drinking an IV, a saline IV. It's really, really, strong, and it can be quite irritating to the stomach. Some people get sickness or diarrhea, and it's a bit risky. So although it's not quite as effective at boosting the blood volume, something more down at more like 1,500, 2,000 milligrams per litre is probably more realistic. And we have a pretty simple preloading protocol that we recommend to athletes, which is to use a pH 1,500, have about half a litre of it the night before a big event, and have another half litre of it with your breakfast or in the sort of 90 minutes before the start. The idea being that just helps to top off your tanks. The extra sodium helps you retain more of the fluid, but ultimately you're also having it a little way ahead so that you've got time to absorb, clear your stomach, be absorbed, and you can wee out any excess. So you're not starting feeling bloated or horrible. We've done a pretty detailed blog on that on our website, which is called How to Start Hydrated. So if people Google that, then they can have a read of it, and that proves to be, I think, quite a successful protocol for a lot of athletes.
Yeah, I was reading that blog the other day actually, and I think that's something that it's just one little thing that athletes can take care of a couple of days before race day, isn't it? That awareness of just drinking more water or drinking extra water isn't actually going to help. It's probably going to contribute to the problem. If it hasn't got the sodium concentration right in it, it's not going to do you any favours. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. All right, man. Well, listen, this has been a super interesting conversation. Thanks very much. And I hope that the listeners have managed to take loads of stuff in for especially going to race in hot conditions or even training in hot conditions over the summertime. What have you got on as an athlete at the moment, Andy? You shared with me just before we came on air. You've had a decent success at swim run Scilly Isles recently, haven't you?
I did. I raced with James Phillips, JP, as we call him, who's our resident sports scientist and customer service manager at PH. And James is some of your listeners will definitely know James. He's a really good triathlete. He's done well over sort of Olympic and half Ironman distances in the last few years. And he basically, we decided we'd do the Isles of Scilly swim run, the O race. And I've had a couple of top tens there in the past, but JP dragged me round on the other end of a piece of elastic to third place. So that was
congratulations.
It was a hard day out for someone who's not been doing a lot of training, but we had a good one, and so we've accepted a place at the World Championships in September. So I've got to pull my finger out and train a bit harder the next few weeks, I think.
There's no slacking for you over the summer then, with Otalo, Sweden on the horizon, is there?
No, it's a good excuse to go do some sea swimming though, which I've really been enjoying actually.
Fantastic, man. All right, well, listen, thanks very much for joining us for the hydration special. Give us a little plug if people want to go and find out more. What can they find out about your company and the products?
So the best place to start is precisionhydration.com. We've got a good blog on there, which has been updated recently to have a keyword search on there. So you can search about all sorts of topics. It's not all about hydration. There's lots of other performance related stuff on there. We have a weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for via the website, which is a performance advice based thing, which is getting really popular. If you've got any direct questions, then you can either follow us on Instagram, we're at Precision Hydration, or Twitter at The Sweat Experts, or Facebook, and DM us and we'll answer those, or just send us an email to hello@precisionhydration.com, and JP and myself and the rest of the team are on hand, and you get a reply from a real human being. So it's ask us your hydration questions, and we'll be happy to try and answer them if we can.
Brilliant stuff, man. Well, listen, thanks a lot. It's been really informative. I think we've had a load of quality information here that people are going to be able to take away and turn into actions that are really going to help their training and then help their racing as well. So it's been brilliant, man. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Great to chat to you.
And all right, there we go. What do you guys think? I hope you've enjoyed that. There was an absolute ton of information on there. Thanks so much for Andy. We recorded this a couple of weeks ago when it was baking hot and the poor guy had his windows open because it was 36 degrees in his office or something crazy like that. So thanks very much to Andy for taking the time. Remember, you guys can go over to precisionhydration.com and you can take the online sweat test. If you're really struggling with performing in the heat, or you're really struggling with your hydration and electrolyte balance, you can take an in-person sweat test and just book it with them them direct. And if you've never tried their stuff, remember, you can get $9.99's worth of free precision hydration using the code OxygenAddict at their website and basically try it for free with no risk. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of this week's show. We'll be back as usual with both me and Hells in the studio. Until then, thanks to our sponsors, teamoxygenaddict.com, to foodcell.co.uk and precisionhydration.com. I hope you guys have a superb summer, a great safe training and racing week, and we'll be back next week with more news, results, and hopefully triathlon inspiration for you all. All right, guys, take it easy, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers now. See ya.